Is misogyny the new extremism? Yeah, it is. Incels, guns, and toxicity. Here's why misogyny is a public threat. Welcome back to Stay At Home Feminist. Your soft girl era starts here, along with the fall of the patriarchy. I'm your host, Binx, and today we're diving into something real ugly. Misogyny. And we're asking a big question. Is misogyny a form of extremism? And if you're on this side of the internet, you probably already gathered that, yeah, it definitely is. But let's really get into the meat and potatoes of that. Today, we're going to dive deep into this world and discuss how misogyny is fueling gun violence, the rise of incel culture, femicide, and how the UK has decided to label misogyny as extremism. As we all know, misogyny is a toxic little seed that grows into some pretty dangerous stuff. And as we've covered on the podcast before, the patriarchy and white supremacy are two structures, pillars, if you will, that uphold a lot of the same variables. So we'll really be able to connect that in this episode. And I want you to keep that in mind as we sort of talk through some of these concepts. Unfortunately, because misogyny is so normalized, some of you might be listening in on this episode like, what do you mean extremism? Like, what do you mean that it's a form of extremism, huh? So just to jump in real quick, let's dive into some numbers so we can get a grasp on how extreme the ripples and the impacts and the tangibleness of misogyny as a form of hate and extremism is. Every 10 minutes, somewhere in the world, a woman or girl is killed by someone she knows and probably loves. Again, every 10 minutes, a girl or a woman is killed by an intimate partner or a family member. Every 10 minutes. Like, what? In this episode, which is going to be like 90 minutes long, that means 9 women or girls have been slain. Like, that is horrible to think about. Another terrifying stat is that 1 in 3 women have faced violence at some point in their life. Yes, 1 in 3. And like the sad thing or like the alarming thing to me is that I feel like when I heard this stat, I was like, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's higher. Like every woman I know has faced some sort of violence at some point in their life. And that number is only like increased if they are a queer woman or a woman of color. You know, in America, specifically Black and Indigenous women are harmed at alarming rates, as we've talked about in other episodes, whether that's through the healthcare system or just society or, you know, whether it's systemic or like just people in society. Like it's so overt. It's not covert. It's everywhere. Here's another scary one. Oh, in female genital mutilation, it's up by 15% compared to where it was 8 years ago. So yeah, the patriarchy isn't just like some annoying thing. It's deadly. It's harmful. But let's rewind a little bit now that we've gotten our bearings. What is misogyny? Because it is so prevalent and because it is sort of a buzzword these days, let's talk about what it really is. In the book Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny, Kate Mann, she defines misogyny as a system that enforces patriarchal norms and expectations by punishing women who deviate from them. Misogyny is not primarily a matter of psychology of individuals. Rather, it is a matter of the social norms, expectations, and consequences that order the lives of women and girls under a system of patriarchal oppression. So what does that mean? Basically, misogyny isn't about a few bad apples or some guy's personal issue. It's a whole system designed to enforce patriarchal norms. Specifically, enforce these norms by punishing women or girls who dare to step out of line. So it's less about individual mindsets and more about the social rules and expectations and consequences that society uses to keep women and girls in check. All that to say, misogyny isn't just like that one dude being an a-hole on the internet. It's a whole structural issue that really impacts us all, no matter what gender you identify with. You might be wondering, like, why are we talking about misogyny as extremism now? And we'll get into it. I mean, look at the direction that the world is going, but that the US is going right now to have reelected certain people after everything we've seen. Like, it is very shocking and horrifying to see so many of like the different different levels of misogyny at play. And it's starting to me, as someone who's been a feminist and an activist for like over a decade at this point, it's starting to feel like to me that misogyny here, it's like the gift that keeps on giving in a horrible way. And as soon as we deal with one thing, it's like 10 more things pop up, like whack-a-mole or something. But also I saw a headline that the UK legally had made misogyny a form of extremism that they're going to take seriously in connection to terrorism and violence. And I was like, wow, like that feels like such a breakthrough. And it feels like, duh, when you say it. And I just feel like I've been conditioned personally to like not even think that was an option because misogyny is so normalized. Even for me, who someone is like trying to point it out and be aware of it and unlearn my internalized misogyny and talk about these issues and point them out so we can like acknowledge them and correct them. And I was just like, whoa, yeah. Why are we all not saying misogyny is a form of extremism? Like, duh, I kind of felt like that wasn't an option. So I really, really want to use that as inspiration for us on the other side of the pond, across the pond, to think about that. And again, like it is so hard sometimes to pinpoint misogyny because it is so vast, so systemic, and because violence against women is normalized. So here are some examples of the way that violence against women is just so everywhere to the point where it's just like expected almost. Okay, I think one of the lowest fruit here is workplace harassment and retaliation. Until the Me Too movement, this was like, of course that's going to happen to you. And of course, no one is going to have your back about it. Like now I think things are getting better, but it depends on the industry and it's still pervasive. Women who report sexual harassment are often fired or they're blacklisted or they're publicly discredited. Look at the women who came forward against some of the most powerful politicians. Look at Christine Ford Blasey, I can't remember her name, the women who've come forward against judges on Supreme Court like Anita Hill. Or look at the women who have come forward against Donald Trump. Like they were just dragged by the media so viciously and so discredited to the point where some of them had to move, some of them had to change their career paths. Think about if it's happening at that level so publicly, think about how much worse it can be when it's happening at a smaller level, when you don't have the support of people behind you. And you know who's in office? Donald Trump and Brett Kavanaugh and Clarence Thomas. They're all still holding very powerful positions. Misogyny creates extremist hostility in professional environments, and it punishes women for seeking accountability. Another horrible way that misogyny is normalized is as a weapon of war. It's known, it's a fact, it's common knowledge that in conflicts worldwide, women are systematically as a method of terrorizing communities. This was seen during the Rwandan genocide or in Bosnia. It's seen in Gaza. Misogyny is so extreme that it is a method of war. Misogyny is so pervasive and so extreme that it's militarized in acts of war and genocide. I think something in America that we are very desensitized to is the way in which mass shootings and domestic terrorism are linked to misogyny. Many mass shooters have histories of domestic violence or cite hatred for women as a motivating factor. When we talk about gun reform in the US, it's like, okay, let people have guns. Let safe people have guns. Like if you have a record of DV, you should not be able to have gun. And like that is an extreme point of view in America. This seems like common sense gun laws to me, but that is an extreme point of view in America. I can't imagine if women were predominantly gun owners and perpetrators of DV that this system would be like, yeah, give them guns. Give them guns. The Isla Vista massacre committed by Elliot Rodger, he explicitly targeted women because he was rejected by women. He put that in his like manifesto or notes or whatever. And he cited being an incel, an involuntary celibate, as his reasons essentially of why he went on a killing spree. You know, we've seen internationally terrorists like Anders Breivik and the Christchurch shooter who cited hating feminism and gender equality in their manifestos. Misogyny fuels broader extremist ideologies. It is what it is. Those are just like a few handpicked examples, and we'll dive into it a little more concretely throughout the episode. And again, misogyny isn't just this personal prejudice. It's a motivating factor in public acts of violence, which is very scary to think about. Another very relevant example is political and religious extremism that's happening throughout the world, but more and more in the US. You know, we see anti-women laws and legislation being passed. We see this with the repeal of Roe v. Wade, and it really shows how religious and political groups, and when they work together especially, use misogyny as a tool tool to mobilize their base. And time again, whether it's evangelical Christians in the US or Al-Qaeda in Iraq or the Taliban in Afghanistan, we see misogyny serve as foundational principles for extremist political and religious agendas. We see the way it's used to police women's freedom. Again, countries like Afghanistan under the Taliban enforce strict rules preventing women from accessing education, work, or even public spaces without male supervision. In the US, our legislators are talking about making it hard or impossible for pregnant women to travel without a male counterpart. That all comes under this abortion restriction and state lines and all of that nonsense. They're trying to restrict women's ability to travel when they're pregnant, which I can't even wrap my head around that happening in the US. Like, it's so prevalent and scary. And again, like, it is why we need to be so keeping our finger on the pulse of these issues, because these extremists want you to be so overwhelmed with misogyny that A, it becomes normal, which I am guilty of that. I'm sure we all are to some degree, but B, that you're exhausted. I know after the results of this last election.
I didn't get that.
Oh my God. So why are you listening to me? Siri. Nothing, Siri, never mind.
Okay.
Nosy bitch. Holy cow. She literally terrified me. Okay. After the results of the last election, it left me feeling very, very like, I can't do this anymore, guys. I need to opt out. Take a break. Mental health is important. And I've been doing that. And also, like, you got to get back in the game, girl. That's what they want. They want you to be so tired or feel so helpless that you opt out. And you're not helpless. We're powerful. And we're more powerful together in community, in arm. You know, they tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds, babe. They did not know we were seeds. So in more positive news, let's talk about the UK's move to classify misogyny as extremism. Snaps for the UK. Yes, girl. So the UK has officially started treating misogyny as a form of extremism. Love to see it. Love to see it. So happy to see someone finally put this on the record, because yeah, why does this matter? I mean, I think we all can see why. This is huge, and it changes the way that we think about misogyny, and it sets a really good precedent for other countries, not just to think of misogyny as like bad vibes or bad opinions, but as something that can lead to real violence, that can lead to hate crimes, that can lead to mass murder, terrorism, those things we were talking about before. But also, like, not even in the most extreme examples, like DV, femicide, just unfortunately the list goes on. But yes, in the UK, misogyny is finally getting the extremist label that it deserves. Home Secretary Yvette Cooper is revamping the country's counter-extremism strategy. And guess what? They're not just going to be calling out the standard far-right or Islamist extremists that we're so accustomed to like identifying as extremists, but also the violent ideologies behind incel culture, you know, that online cesspool that blames women for everything and sometimes escalates to real world violence, as the UK saw with the 2021 Plymouth shooting. So essentially this means that they're going to be diving deep into how young people are radicalized online and in real life, with plans to disrupt and redirect energy. So that's essentially where the UK is going with this. The SparkNotes version of that. I'm sure there's a lot more important details, but that's just like the TLDR. Yeah, it's exciting to see. And I hope it really hits a lot harder than, you know, my uncle's not all men arguments. But yeah, time will tell. We'll see. Good to see misogyny's extremist tendencies finally being taken seriously. You know, honestly, it's really about fucking time. I think something that this really shines a light on is that, again, misogyny is not just about hating women. It can also be sort of like this gateway drug to other toxic things, or this is just this gateway. It doesn't have to be a drug, just a gateway to other toxic things like white supremacy, like other extremist movements. I feel like it's like toxic masculinity and conspiracy theories have this like party going on in the basement of Reddit or YouTube. And suddenly, like, people are in this pipeline of misogyny being extremism and turning into more different types of extremism. It's like, who knew being mad at women could escalate things so quickly? Women knew that, but you don't ask us. So yeah, I think it's about time we're treating misogyny as extremism. I'm very pleased to see the UK doing that, and I hope that other countries follow follow suit. It should be happening everywhere, not just the UK. Speaking of misogyny as extremism, let's dive a little deeper into gun violence and misogyny, because gun violence is so prevalent here in the United States. First of all, misogyny is violence. So I feel like it can't be that hard to find that connection between misogyny and gun violence, because misogyny itself is violence. But yeah, in case you don't know, there's a pretty solid link between gun violence and misogyny. As I said before, a lot of these mass shooters, they have a history of domestic violence, or they have a history of hating women. And when you look at it that way, it feels like misogyny is sort of training wheels for violence. It's sort of like ground one in a lot of ways. And it makes sense because misogyny is fueled by hate, and hate is step one for violence. And I mean, it's really easy to like laugh at incels, thinking about them like writing in their diary every day, being like, I hate women. All my problems come from women. And it's just like, okay, loser. But it's that kind of toxic thinking and these like societal rejects in some sort of ways that like really, it does turn deadly, and it is not a rare occurrence these days. It is really common. So a lot of media narratives, when like, especially when the shooter is white or the terrorists are white, they're like, their mental health isn't well. And it's like, no, he's a terrorist. Yeah, sure, mental health is part of it, but there's like a lot of other stuff going on here, which, could you imagine if on September 12th, they were like, Osama bin Laden, he really struggles with his mental health. Like, they would never do that to a brown or a black person. To this day, I see white people on the internet talking about how George Floyd was an addict, as if that justifies the way he was murdered. Like, what? And he wasn't even doing anything violent. Yet these white men and boys can shoot up movie theaters and schools and synagogues and churches and pre-Ks, elementary school. And it's like, well, they're having a rough day. And that is part of the problem. The fact that we can't call a spade because of racism and white supremacy is part of the problem. But I digress. Another part of the problem, and again, it's not these people's mental health. Let's call it a spade. Let's call it what it is. People are getting radicalized so quickly online. Online spaces like Reddit, 4chan, they've become echo chambers for blaming women for everything and making women the scapegoat, as well as people of color often. Remember, misogyny and white supremacy are like best buds linking arms hand in hand. So everything I'm saying about the way it applies to women, like it is very, very true for the way that white supremacy and xenophobia and all of those things apply to Black people, brown people, indigenous people here in the United States and around the world. So again, good to keep that in mind. And when we talk about intersectional feminism, which is what we're doing when we're talking about feminism, because if your feminism is not intersectional, it is not feminism. I'm talking about this as a white woman, but there's like more levels of hate. Again, if you were a queer woman, a brown woman, a Black woman, that prejudice and that hate can just multiply. And it's because this radicalization pipeline happening on the internet, it's so easy that if someone is hateful and misogynistic, they are probably also going to be white supremacists. They are probably also going to be xenophobic and really, really racist beliefs about immigrants. We literally had a former president, talk about how immigrants were eating dogs and cats because he saw it online somewhere and it was not verified and it was not true. And Haitian immigrants in those communities didn't bring their kids to school because threats of violence from that. So that wasn't even intentional radicalization. That was just someone being radicalized and being a mouthpiece. So anyways, back to radicalization through online platforms. I digress, but it is important to sort of lay out these dots so we can connect them. But yeah, it's not just venting. These places are grooming grounds for real world violence. And for any men listening or any women who have maybe conservative or not super compassionate men in their life, you're a man and your women don't like me or I feel rejected support groups turns into some sort of shooter recruitment seminar, maybe it's time you rethink your hobbies. Maybe just stick to journaling for a bit. Maybe you can keep some thoughts to yourself. And as much as the internet is the platform or the channel that this funnel of hate is being spread through, if we want to get into how we actually start stopping online violence, it is important to realize that the internet is not the problem. It is just the vehicle. And also, if we want to shut down this pipeline between keyboard warriors and actual harm, we need platforms to step up. I mean, we saw what happened in November with X. Like, that was crazy. We need better moderation. We need to be holding bad actors accountable. And we need to stop these algorithms from serving hate on a silver platter. So why is the internet so good at breeding hate? As I'm sure you know, as we both know, and anonymity makes it really easy to be a jerk. It's easy to have a lot of courage and be so hateful when you can't be held accountable. When trolls are in my comment section saying the most horrible things, 9.5 times out of 10, they are like a faceless, nameless profile with no post. And I'm like, yeah, of course you're gonna be talking shit. You're anonymous. You don't really have to think about the way in which you're being a troll. You can just be a troll. But another thing is that algorithms prioritize outrage. It can be like a recipe for toxicity. And a lot of times when these echo chambers get going, and we all have been in our own little echo chamber, like, I'm not trying to point fingers, like I live in an echo chamber as well. That is just like a function of being online today. But a lot of time when these echo chambers get going, it's like some sort of hate flavored pyramid scheme. Like, it just ramps up one thing to another. And it's just like, all of a sudden you're a conspiracy theorist. And people are like getting other people to like join in, and they're recruiting others, and it's very cult-like and it's very scary. So how do we stop it? I mean, my solution for everything is partial solutions, because we are so far down this road with so little barricades and protections when it comes to social media. But, you know, I think education, accountability, and like having platforms regulate hate as much as they do nip slips. Why are we so obsessed with women's nipples? We should be more obsessed with the way your platform is radicalizing people to be violent. Like, I'm sorry, but if you can like serve me ads based on things you heard me whispering near my phone, you can crack this one out. I'm not a woman in STEM, okay? Not a woman in STEM, but I know there are plenty of you that can figure this out, which is funny because earlier my phone, Siri literally like responded to me when I was talking to myself and not her. I know after the results of this last election.
I didn't get that.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So why are you listening to me, Siri? I'm excited to listen to that back and see what I said that made her be like, yeah? I'm like, I'm not talking to you, babe. I think this past year has really shown the rise of the incels and online radicalization, and it is very scary to see. So I wanted to spend some time talking a little bit about that. So first of all, who are incels? Let's talk about it. If you haven't heard of them, consider yourself lucky. As I said before, incel stands for involuntary celibate, but it really seems to me that these people, that these men are way more interested in blaming women for all of their problems than actually like fixing anything in their life. The incel culture basically starts with blaming women for rejecting them, and then it sort of snowballs into a full-blown ideology that glorifies violence a lot of the time. I mean, we were all there, and I hate to even bring it up because I don't want to give this guy like any more attention, but we all heard that viral sound, and a lot of us saw that video of we control your bodies, we control your bodies. Like, that guy is an incel. That's an incel, and that's why he's so hateful and violent, because if you don't know what an incel is, that guy is. Another scary thing about this is incels are organized, and not in a fun type A, cute, like color-coded way. These guys aren't just lurking in basements. They are actively recruiting vulnerable young men and bringing them into their hate-filled groups and ideologies. It's toxic platforms, it's toxic vibes. Reddit, YouTube, 4chan. These are all basically just like group chats for misogyny, where hate gets amplified and repeated until it feels normal. And again, algorithms love drama. Social media is like, ooh, you like this incel post? You watch this whole incel video? Here's 50 effing more. And they feed this cycle, pulling people deeper and deeper and deeper into this abyss until you don't know which way is up and down. And you just think like that this culture and this way of thinking is the right way of being. And we're seeing this hate go from online to IRL. It's not just online trolling, which there is plenty of. Again, these echo chambers lead to real world violence against women. And it's not this edgy, misunderstood, I need help with my mental health thing. It's terrifying. It's terrifying. And we should stop coddling these men, because clearly that hasn't worked, and we should start holding them accountable. We have to do better. It's time to stop treating these platforms as harmless, first of all, and start holding them accountable for letting this garbage grow. And I know that in America, like the number one thing is like free speech, but it's like, yeah, there should be freedom of free speech in the press and like all of these things. I totally support that. And also there has to be some sort of regulation against like blatant misinformation and recruitment tactics from hate groups. Like, come on, those shouldn't be the same thing. thing is free speech. I don't see how that makes sense. And I think when you understand the historical context of how the internet has been a breeding ground from hate groups, you understand why we need those sort of barometers and those safeguards so much more. So back in the 90s, when people were just getting computers, and if you were like me, a 90s kid, like your whole family had one computer that you shared back in the day. And, you know, people were just figuring out how to send an email without crashing their computer or whatever was going on back then. White supremacist groups were already online and setting up shop online. Platforms like Stormfront popped up in 1996, and they gave white supremacist groups an unregulated space to recruit and spread misinformation. Meanwhile, the FBI, who should be regulating this, like they weren't online yet. They didn't even know to look for this online. Just like everyone else, they were just like catching up and figuring out what the World Wide Web was. And yeah, this was way before meme culture. So these groups weren't just like posting memes and having a good time. They were targeting isolated folks, and they were spreading misinformation and conspiracy theories to radicalize folks. A lot of the times they framed their propaganda as heritage preservation to make it more palpable, or sort of like, you know, they're not just going to be like, join us as white supremacists. You know, they lure you in, making things more palpable. So they're like, hey, come join us in preserving our white heritage. But that playbook that they wrote back then is still being used today. And the people who should be regulating this and holding people accountable, like never caught up, it feels like, because extremist groups are still using those same tactics that they were using in the 90s today, but way more advanced. Basically, extremist groups figured out how to exploit the internet before anyone else did. And we're still dealing with the fallout. Today, I think one of the biggest like recruitment tools is this concept of red pilling. It's often framed as like a personal revelation, but like red pill is like a reference to the Matrix. Breaking out of the Matrix and becoming your best self is kind of the like guise, but it is a recruitment tool. It is a recruitment tool that feeds young men this narrative that women and feminists are to blame for their struggles, and has incel communities pull people deeper into their like toxic ideology. And again, like the same way that incels are doing this with women and misogyny, people are also being radicalized by white supremacist groups online too. It's not just like people who are anti-women are using these tactics. It is people who are anti anything that isn't straight white male, basically. Speaking of which, let's dive into a little bit more about where that overlap of what misogyny and white supremacy is, because there is a lot there. Definitely an overlap of hate. That Venn diagram has like a big part in the middle. Misogyny does not exist in a vacuum. A lot of these extremist groups, like many of the white supremacist ones, for example, have deeply misogynistic views baked in, and vice versa. A lot of deeply misogynist groups have very racist ideologies baked in as well. It's like the world's worst lasagna with layers of racism with a thick misogyny sauce throughout. A lot of these groups see women as objects they can control. And a lot of this boils down to the patriarchy, right? Men who feel like they're losing power, so they double down on hate, whether that's towards women or people of color. Like we've talked about it on this podcast before with the Great Replacement theory. That is a good example of how this is happening and perpetuated towards people of color in the same way it is to women, and especially women of color. And as much as this specific form of hate feels very relevant in America, hating women is a worldwide phenomenon. And that violence against women is called femicide. And it's a global crisis. It's not just a problem that's happening in the US or in the West. Femicide, aka killing, murdering women just because they're women, it's happening around the world. And again, it is a global crisis. I mean, just thinking about this summer, like in the UK, we saw that horrific case of those young girls being stabbed. And we saw Rebecca Cheptegei, the Ugandan marathon runner. Her boyfriend burned her alive. Are you kidding me? And we're seeing the case in France where a man drugged his wife like a bajillion times so other men could SA her, sexually assault her. This violence comes in so many different shapes and sizes, but it has one thing in common. And it is that these people were clearly not to see women as human, and clearly don't know how to empathize with women. And it's especially heinous to see it happening to young girls or for this to be happening to women by their intimate partner. But as we talked about in the beginning, every 10 minutes, a woman or girl is murdered by their intimate partner or family member. So it shouldn't surprise you, but it should outrage you. This is outrageous. You should feel outraged if that's what you're feeling right now. And again, I pointed to these like 3 that I picked off the top of my head because they were in the headlines and they were so shocking. Again, even though now that you know the stats, they shouldn't be, which is horrible to say, but I want to say it so we recognize that these incidents are not isolated. It's part of this world that we live in where women's lives are treated as less valuable. Did you know that in certain countries, Mexico is one of them, that the femicide rate is so high, it's classified as an epidemic? Women are being murdered at alarming rates just for being women. And yeah, a part of it is because of the ways in which misogyny makes women second-class citizens who aren't seen as valuable. But another part of it is because of the way that systemically men and these perpetrators are not held accountable. They keep doing these crimes. They keep being a part of this hate because they don't feel like they're going to be held accountable. Oftentimes they know, in fact, that they're not going to be held accountable. The systemic murder of women is gendered terrorism, and it's happening in such an alarming way all across the world in so many different shapes and sizes. And it's so frustrating and devastating to talk about. I know normally on my shows, I try to be like more lighthearted and I'm a jokey, fun person. And I want these concepts to be like digested in a way that feels easy and like we're all in this together and hopeful. So like I apologize for having a Eeyore cloud over my head right now. But this topic, while it's important, is just so frustrating and disgusting to me. And it's hard not to feel like we're having this conversation a million years too late. But at the same time, you know, like no time like the present, babe. I think a horrific example of femicide running rampant in the US is the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. I didn't know much about this until I went on TikTok and was able to learn about it from Indigenous people on the platform. I hadn't ever really heard of this in mainstream media. And I've lived in states that have very, very large Indigenous communities. So I felt like especially alarmed that I hadn't heard about it. The crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women is devastating, and we need to do something about it now. And if you haven't heard about this, I encourage you to do your own research and get involved with Indigenous communities and follow Indigenous creators to learn from them directly. But since we're here having this conversation, essentially what I'm referring to is the fact that Native women, I'm talking about in the US, but it's unfortunately not just a problem here in the United States. Indigenous women are murdered at rates 10 times higher than the national average. Most of these cases go unsolved. Why? Basically, systemic racism, a justice system that is not showing up for Indigenous people like it should be. The media prioritizes white women's stories over these stories. And this is a good example of where misogyny and white supremacy intersect. And it's creating a very deadly combination that treats Indigenous women as disposable. And it leaves them vulnerable to this kind of violence. And it's just horrible to know that this is happening at such an alarming rate. It's disgusting. It feels like the system is designed to fail them, and we shouldn't be staying silent about it. And if you're someone like me who has white privilege, wealth privilege, platform privilege, like, let's talk about this. Let's highlight this. Let's help do something about this. Again, when I found out about this, I felt so, for lack of a better word, dumb, because I was like, how did I not know this was happening? And then I was like, oh, no wonder I didn't know, because media nowhere is talking about this, which is why it is important to follow Indigenous content creators, Indigenous nonprofits, to learn about this information firsthand. Please do that. So yeah, all that to say is misogyny is failing us, and it is used as a tool to control and oppress, and it is violent. And as we talked about with the rape as a form of war, authoritarian regimes use misogyny as a tool to control women. I think it's really easy to talk about where this extremism is maybe most depicted in the media, like in Afghanistan, or like we're having an extremist group like the Taliban is rolling back women's rights. But, you know, let's look at how this is happening in the US and seeing the way women's rights are being rolled back, which we've talked about on multiple episodes. So feel free to refer to those if you want something a little bit more in depth. But I would be remiss not to point out in this episode of misogyny, the way that it weaponizes gender and the way that controlling women's bodies, education, controlling their freedom is a way that these regimes, that these people stay in control. It's state-sponsored misogyny, and it's happening globally, and it's happening rampantly in the United States. So I know that was a lot. I know that was heavy, but I think it is so important to dive in to these topics. I think step one of cutting the cancer out is knowing that we got cancer, kind of thing. Bad analogy, but it works. So knowing that was so heavy, before we close out, let's reset our energy with some feminist affirmations, because as daunting as this might be, the more you know, the more powerful you can be. And fighting misogyny as extremism requires a strong mind and it requires a strong heart. And as I say over and over again, joy, love, compassion, softness, those are all radical acts in this system, in this regime, in this patriarchy, in this world in which misogyny wants to control you and keep you down or keep you silent. So if you don't know where to start by accessing your joy and your love and your compassion and leaning into your soft girl era. And again, the more we know, the more that we can call things out when we see it. Sometimes very hard to see things clearly when you're sort of in this fog or this daze that normalizes them so much. So with that being said, let's jump into our feminist affirmations. I reject all forms of misogyny, no matter how subtle. I reject all forms of misogyny, no matter how subtle. I reject all forms of misogyny, no matter how subtle. I will continue to challenge harmful systems that oppressed marginalized groups. I will continue to challenge harmful systems that oppressed marginalized groups. I will continue to challenge harmful systems that oppress marginalized groups. My voice and actions matter in creating a safer world. My voice and actions matter in creating a safer world. My voice and actions matter in creating a safer world. Well, on that note, let's wrap up the show. Thank you for being in the trenches with me today, because misogyny is a doozy. And it is nice sort of to spend time talking about more applicable ways it shows up, but it is important to, go through those peaks and those valleys as well. Today, we really dug into misogyny as a form of extremism, which, was inspired by the UK's landmark move to deem it as such. And we left here with a lot more knowledge about something we already knew, which was misogyny isn't just toxic, it's dangerous. Please, please continue to educate yourselves and get involved in activism or support your community, your friends, your sisters in ways that combat misogyny. No thing is too small. No action is too small. I would love to hear from you on what this episode brought up for you. If it reminded you of any stories that you have of misogyny that you didn't even realize were misogyny at the time, or just reflecting on the state of the world today, I'd really, really love to hear from you guys on how this episode hit. And yes, again, support organizations that are fighting the good fight, support each other. Thank you again for joining. This is a new podcast, so please like, comment, subscribe. Let me know how you're feeling about it. Let me know you're watching. Let me know. Thank you so much for joining. Until next time, let's keep smashing the patriarchy. And maybe, take a break from the internet while you're at it, or do whatever feels empowering to you in terms of accessing your joy and leaning into your soft girl era. I'll see you next time. Mwah. Bye.